Theatre of Blood is a 1973 released horror film directed by Douglas Hickox.
Stars Vincent Price as a stage actor by the name of Edward Lionheart. After he was spurned by some critics for an award, killed himself. And then a couple of years later, he reappears and starts murdering them one by one in the style of killings from Shakespeare plays. He has a very high opinion of his own acting, shall we say. All the critics think he's a little bit on the hammy side, or a large bit on the hammy side, to be honest. And yeah, often gave him quite poor reviews. The lack of award, which he thought was richly deserved, was the final straw. And his daughter features in the film as well, who's played by Diana Rigg, which is one of the reasons we're doing this. Obviously, she sadly passed away recently.
So it's October. Somehow we got to October again. What we do in October is we do a month of horror films, or horror-tinged films, leading us right up to Halloween. So this is our first choice this week, Theatre of Blood. We actually did a Vincent Price film 2 weeks ago. We could have started October with that film, couldn't we?
We should have done, yeah.
Vincent Price kind of giving it his all in this one.
I mean, it's just the right amount. It is quite cheesy and a bit hammy, but just the right amount of cheese and ham.
It's kind of devilishly good fun. It's very hammy at times, but it lives up to its title, Theatre of Blood. It's quite bloody too. So this comes out in 1973. We're in a world now where films, I think censorships were relaxing somewhat, and films started to get a little bit more vicious, a little bit bloodier. So obviously Vincent Price is the lead. He is the hammy actor. But all the critics in it are like actual British classical actors. So you've got people like Michael Hordern and Arthur Lowe and Jack Hawkins and Robert Morley, Harry Andrews and people like that. So big kind of calibre British classical actors that probably performed in many, Shakespeare plays over the years. The thing with Vincent Price is, he is known for playing these hammy horror roles. We know him from Mask of the Red Death that we did 2 weeks ago, Witchfinder General that we did, I think maybe last Halloween, and all the other hundreds of, The Tingler and The Fly and so many great films of Vincent Price. But he's known for those kind of hammy horror appearances. He's not known for the kind of the classical Shakespeare roles, but he can deliver those lines. He's so good at delivering those lines, and I think that's why this film's quite, it's a lot of fun, this film. Vincent Price actually considered this film to be one of his favourites, and I think maybe that's because he, was kind of given the chance to play those Shakespeare roles that maybe he, didn't or wasn't known for in his career.
Diana Rigg felt the same. I think she was one of her favourite performances of her own as well. Yeah, like I said at the start, that's one of the reasons we picked this, because she sadly passed away recently. Obviously famous for The Avengers. The only woman to actually marry James Bond in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and more recently a great role in Game of Thrones. So yeah, a long, varied career should be sadly missed.
I read there was a really nice write-up by Edgar Wright in The Guardian, because I think her final role is his next film.
Oh right.
And it's an amazing kind of piece about him working with her, on set, and then I think she he had to do some pickups, some overdubs right at the end, and she was kind of willing to do it all the way through, even when she was, right near her death. She was willing to give her all to Edgar Wright, right up until the last. And I think he literally spoke to her 2 weeks before she actually passed away. And it's worth giving it a read if you like either of those two people. So yeah, no, it's nice that they consider this film a favourite of theirs. So like you say, all the kills are based on Shakespeare plays, which I think is very clever. I think it's clever. I'm amazed it's an idea that hasn't been done before. It's a kind of it's almost like Seven. You know how Seven is the kind of the classic serial killer film, and it's got such a great idea because they use the 7 deadly sins. Well, this too, it's got that, using deaths or murders from the Shakespeare plays is kind of the perfect way to do it. For a film like this to work, the script's got to work, and the script does work. It's got some really great lines in there. Some of it's hammy, and some of it's just great kind of wordplay. And when it's delivered, like we said in The Mask of the Red Death, when it's delivered by someone like Vincent Price or many of the other actors that are in this film, it just works, and it's great fun to sit through.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I hadn't seen it before, I'd heard of it, but no, I hadn't seen it, and no, I really enjoyed it. It's not perfect. There's a few little things that didn't quite work. When there's a scene, someone gets beheaded, and there's a bit of a continuity thing where suddenly
Oh yeah,
the head
yeah.
is in a different place in the next scene. It's like, well, how did that happen? So that's a bit confusing. And there's a bit of a sort of a plot twist character reveal towards the end, which was pretty obvious very early on. And I thought, is it supposed to be obvious, or is it supposed to be a big reveal that I was supposed to be shocked by?
I have to say, while I was watching the film, I was thinking this because so this reveal is not it's not a huge reveal because you kind of worked it out straight away. And I was thinking while watching it because of course we now live in a world. I mean, to mention a film like Seven, in the 90s we had quite a few films that had these big twist endings. But in the 70s, did they have? I mean, there are a few films that have things like that in there. But so I was sitting there wondering, was it supposed to be a big twist, or was it just part of a fun plot? And that you don't, it's a bit kind of, a bit Scooby Dooish, isn't it? I suppose in a way, and it's like is it doesn't need to have that big twist, and maybe you just because I mean, of course, these films, a lot of young people would have watched these films on TV maybe in the 70s and 80s. And if you were very young, it would have played differently to you. Whereas now we've got all these kind of high tech, very cleverly written films and twists and turns and stuff. So I was wondering, maybe it wasn't supposed to be this big twist. I think if you love horror, if you love these films from that period, it's going to totally be for you.
Yeah.
It's lots of fun. It's very campy, but also I think if you're a fan of a lot of those actors and that period, that kind of earlier period of British film, it's really nice to see them all kind of together. There's some great moments with these. I mean, like you said, some of it's quite silly. I mean, there is this scene where one of the murders, the guy gets his head cut off in his sleep. So it's Arthur Lowe. He comes home. He's been out for a party with his wife maybe, and they come home and they find this big chest in the middle of their bedroom, which they find things a little bit odd. And then his wife, played by Joan Hickson, of course, famous for Miss Marple. She's this kind of nagging wife. To him, and they're like, "Oh, we'll deal with it in the morning." So they go to sleep, and then of course, they're fast asleep, snoring away, and then this little kind of window opens in the chest, and Vincent Price is in there, and then he kind of pulls the lid up and gets out with someone else, and they're like, "Wow, okay, you've been sitting in that box for how long?" And then they climb out, and they go into this kind of weird. Very, I mean, blackly humoured scene where they basically, surgically remove his head. And there's a very funny scene where I think his assistant puts his latex gloves on, but it's clearly filmed in reverse because
I thought that it was like it put on so perfectly. It's like, how do you do that?
I don't know. To me, it just felt the whole because the film moves quite quickly. I mean, I have to say that my only negative thing with it is that after a while, because the murders are all quite kind of episodic. And after a while, it starts to get it loses its trick in a way, It starts because
you're kind of just waiting for the next one.
Yeah, once he's revealed, and once you know who he is, and you realise that he is still alive and he is doing these murders, they carry on knocking off all the critics one by one to kind of get to that finale, and it starts to get a little bit kind of. Right, when we're going to get to the end here, which is, I would say, it's one flaw.
But it does have a sword fight on trampolines, so
they do.
That makes up for it.
It's no Jason Bourne fight, but it's it's pretty good. It's quite fun. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's got going for it. It's a lot of fun. It's a very memorable kind of murder scene. Some of it is quite vicious. I have to say that beginning, the opening scene with So the first murder is Michael Hordern, and he's like the first critic to be killed. And I wouldn't say that's a spoiler, because most of these are actually in the trailer. If you watch the trailer, it pretty much gives away the original trailer it pretty much gives away the whole film. We complain about trailers now giving away films. You go watch the trailer, or don't, but it kind of gives away the film. But I do actually love in the trailer it says guest victims, and it's got all the actors that are in it as guest victims, which is quite fun. Which also kind of gives it away, I suppose. But anyway, the first death is Michael Hordern, and he's a critic, but he's also on the board of chairmen for a building that's got some unwanted tenants, shall we say. Some tramps have kind of taken residence there, and they want him. He's an authority figure, and he can go down and tell them all to jog on. So he gets down there, and there's a couple of policemen standing around, and he goes in and he tries to tell them, in Michael Hordern's kind of great way, he tells them to all kind of, move on, and then they kind of attack him, and it's this quite it's very visceral and it's a very vicious attack, and it's kind of a great way to bring you into the film, and it's a bit like Clockwork Orange at times, and it's very in your face, and it's very bloody as well. There's a lot of blood on screen at one point. But then as the film goes on, it kind of, so some of those deaths become a little bit silly. Some of them are quite clever. So it's kind of an odd mixture of a film. I think it's clearly playing on the whole. I mean, if you're a fan of the theatre, this is more a fan of the theatre film than a fan of film. It's a real kind of, I suppose, a thespian piece. So if you're into that world, then it's kind of great fun for that. And I suppose that because obviously my granddad was an actor, and he spent a lot of time on stage, and in fact he probably worked with quite a few of these guys in his career. So I suppose from that point of view, I kind of have a maybe a weird soft spot for it, maybe.
I mean, just going back to the tramps you mentioned, I mean, they're all swigging meths, as in methylated spirits,
Yes.
Constantly, and they're just out of it constantly. But they help Vincent with his murders.
Well, they pick him up, don't they? So
They do, yeah. They rescue him.
When they find him in the Thames, and they kind of pull him out of the muddy Thames water, he drops some lines from Shakespeare. I mean, there's literally just loads of lines from Shakespeare all over the place. And some quite moving moments. The bit in there when he does take his own life is shown, and he reads off the famous "to be or not to be," and it's actually quite a moving moment because the critics are all there and they're kind of laughing at him and ridiculing him, and he's out there on this balcony, and I think it's quite an emotional scene. You're not quite sure what's coming. It's very clever.
I thought there was a great shot in that where obviously his balcony sort of goes round the outside of the building, and he moves around, and they can see him, and then he moves around the corner, and there's some curtains, and they open them like theatre curtains.
I mean, actually, on top of that, it's wonderfully shot. I mean, there's some great camera movements, lots of kind of low angles, and wide lenses being used, and then it's completely shot on location around London, and it's great. And again, if you love these old films, it's great seeing London in a time before. Obviously, London looks very different now. There's so much new buildings that have been put up, and you can see all the old, lots of Docklands. I mean, the Docklands back in the 70s were, nowadays it's all full of apartments, flats, and buildings like that. Lots of homes and places. Where in those days you still had the docks, and you still had that kind of dirty, grimy feel to London. It's really some really wonderful location shooting in this film, which I thought was, and that's what I love about a lot of these old British films, especially if they're filmed around areas and you get to see kind of what it was like before you knew it. I find that really, really interesting, and it's not studio. I mean, there is a theatre they shoot in, and it was a real theatre that was actually demolished a few weeks after this film finished shooting, and so there were no sets. It was all real, and that kind of gives it a kind of a realism. But we did see it on Amazon Prime, but yeah. I do have the. Do you have the blue? You don't have this, do you?
I haven't got the Blu-ray now.
So I got the Arrow Blu-ray. I'll stick that up there. Which I picked up a while ago. Today I watched it again, and then I watched it again, because it's got an amazing commentary by the League of Gentlemen, Jeremy Dyson, Mark Getty, Steve Pemberton, and Reece Shearsmith. They're all on there, and they are very, very fond of this film. I think it was like they have a number of like films that they grew up watching, and this is like one of their favourite films, and I think they've taken a few nods to this in the League of Gentlemen and Psychoville and things like that, and that's really interesting to watch. And there's a few interviews. There's a really interesting interview with Victoria Price, Vincent Price's daughter. That's really interesting, where she talks about him during this film and a little bit about his life too. That was really interesting. And then also a short interview with the composer and an interview with Madeline Smith, Ian Hendry's character's secretary in this film, Rosemary. She turned up in quite a couple of the Carry-Ons and Bond film, things like that. A bit of a scream queen of her day, and yeah. So I think it's a standard. There's not a ton of stuff on there. One thing I did notice though is that the sound on it. I don't know what it was like on Amazon, but the sound was really quiet on this, and it wasn't my player, because when I watched the features, I had it up quite loud and I put the features on and they were really loud, and I was like, oh, because there were moments where I had to kind of turn it up quite a lot, so I'm not sure why that was. Yeah, I mean, it's a standard Arrow. It's got new stuff on the front, and then the original artwork inside as well, and right way up would be good. So yeah, it's a standard Arrow release, and it's perfectly nice.
I mean, there was also a release in the US from Twilight Time, But I think, as with a lot of all of their stuff, I think it's limited, so you might struggle to pick that up now. And there was a release in Australia as well, and all the different releases have different features, so there's a different commentary on each one. So, I mean, if you're a real mega fan of the film, then you might want to pick them all up.
So that was Theatre of Blood, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, let us know in the comments below.
Hit the subscribe button there, and don't forget to push that bell for notifications. There's some other videos to check out over here. Come and find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and join us next week for another one.